my family, we've got a vacation coming up at the end of September, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. And to kind of prepare for our vacation, I've started this new diet, and I figured it would be maybe good to share it with you this morning. For breakfast, I'm having half of a grapefruit, a single piece of all wheat toast, and 8 ounces of organic skim milk. For lunch, it gets better. For lunch, I'm having 4 ounces of lean broiled chicken breast, a cup of steamed zucchini, a glass of herbal tea, mug herbal tea, whatever, and, confession time, one single Oreo cookie. Okay? The cool thing about this particular diet is in the middle of the day, it builds in a snack time for you, which I find incredibly helpful. For snack time, mid-afternoon snack, I polish off the rest of the bag of Oreos, followed by a quart of Neapolitan ice cream and 6 ounces of hot fudge. For dinner, I'll have 2 loaves of garlic bread, 1 large meat lover's pizza, a pitcher of root beer, and 2 Snickers bars for dessert. Now, here's the deal. You all snicker and you laugh a little bit, but you don't know a whole lot about this diet. There's a couple really important facets to it that I feel I should probably share with you. Number one, according to this particular diet, if you eat alone, then the calories don't count at all. Okay? If you eat with people, with friends, the calories don't count against you because it's communal. And third, if you fatten up the people around you, you will look skinnier on your vacation. So needless to say, I'm really excited to go out of town in September. We're in week 2 of our Gospel on the Ground study. And what we're doing for the month of August is we are just hitting the book of James and trying to get the high points in as best as we can. And last week, Webby encouraged us to do a self-evaluation of our discipleship. To ask ourselves, are there areas in our lives where we could use just a little bit more focus? And today, I want to spend some time unpacking one of the perils that James warned the early church to avoid so that they could truly live out the gospel on the ground. The peril or the pitfall that James warned the early church against was that of temptation. Specifically, where did temptation come from and how should it be handled? Now, before we dive into the text this morning, before we dive into James chapter 1, here's what we all know from dieting about temptation. All right, we probably all at one time or another can say this definitively because of our own experience. We can say that when we diet, we start off and we're totally committed to it, right? It's like at the beginning of the year generally, and I'm like, okay, I'm 100% committed to being healthy or to eating well or this and that. But then, Friday comes along and you're hanging out with your friends, or maybe you have a birthday party or a family reunion or something. Something rolls along and you slip. Somebody makes your favorite, macaroni and cheese, or, whether it's like the Oreo pie or whatever it is, you have that one moment of indiscretion where you're like, I'm just this one time. And before long, that one time turns into the plane crashing into the side of the mountain as far as your diet is concerned. Before long, you're rationalizing why it's okay to finish off an entire package of Oreos. Right? You're saying things like, well, it's not the family size package. Or it's the regular Oreos. It's not even the double stuffed. What's the big deal? Temptation is a slippery slope. In real life, we'll say things, or we'll reason, well, if nobody sees me do this sin, or if nobody sees me commit this particular sin, then it's not that big a deal. Or we'll say things like, well, if my friends are doing it, then it must be okay because everybody's doing it. Temptation is a slippery slope of disaster, and if it's not dealt with properly, it will cost us dearly. A few years back, an unusually cold winter struck a sleepy Oregon town. And so a hunter there set out to nab a bear. All right, big bear. He set out to get one for himself. So he trekked into the forest, and for a day or two he searched. And on the second day, he happened upon this giant, beautiful bear. And he was so excited, like he'd prepared for this moment. All right, he was in the moment, ready to make it happen. He raised his gun and he took a deep breath and he steadied himself. And as he pointed his rifle at this bear, the bear suddenly looked up, cocked his head to the left, and said, "What are you doing?" Bear didn't charge. He just stood there, dumbfounded. Perplexed, the hunter replied, because I mean, we don't run into talking bears every day. You can understand his confusion. The hunter replied, "Well, it's cold out, and I was going to shoot you to keep warm." The bear inched forward cautiously, step by step, toward the hunter. And he explained, "Well, I totally understand. It's cold outside. In fact, the only reason I'm here is because I'm hungry. I'd much rather be asleep. But I would prefer that we sit down and talk this over. Surely we can come up with a reasonable solution that makes the both of us happy." So the hunter thinks this over for a minute. And he would sure like to be seen as reasonable. And so he lowers his rifle, and both he and the bear sat down right there in the forest to come up with a reasonable solution to both of their problems. That night, the hunter was enveloped in the cozy warmth of the bear's belly. You get it now, huh? Temptation is the real deal. And if disciples are willing to compromise with it, it will feast on us. I'm going to say that again. Temptation is the real deal. And if disciples are willing to compromise with it, it will feast on us. James puts it this way in James chapter 1, verse 13. "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." Now I want to point out a couple important things from what we just read. Number one, James doesn't lead with "if you are tempted." He says, "when you are tempted." Temptation is an inescapable facet of life. We are not God's sheltered people. We are his scattered people. We are not God's sheltered people. We are his scattered people. Scattered from every corner of the planet so that anyone might have the opportunity to hear the gospel and respond. Temptation is a way of life for the believer. And if we are to mature in our faith, we must do so by handling tests and temptations well. Secondly, James is quick to point out in verse 13 that God is not the source of our temptation. The finger ought not be pointed at Him when temptation surfaces, but rather at our own sinful desires. Now let's be clear. Desire is a good thing. Without the desire for food, we would starve. Without the desire for warmth, we would freeze. Without the desire for sex, the human race would cease to exist. Without fatigue and the desire to rest, our bodies would literally work themselves to death. But desire can get warped, and that's the problem. It's when our desires or our appetites are filled in unhealthy, ungodly ways that our temptations begin to rapidly start poisoning us. In verse 14, James says that our sinful desires entice us. The Greek word that he uses here is the same word that is used to describe fishermen baiting a hook. And if you are a fisherman or you've gone fishing, you understand that you bait a hook so that it will appeal to the fish and hide the hook from the fish, right? You put something appealing on the hook so that it is obscured. Because you and I know that a fish is far less likely to just go jumping on your hooks, right? How many of us would love to have a fishing trip like that? You just toss it in the water and the fish does its thing, it's on the hook, and we're done. I think that's what they do for Long John Silvers. I can taste it in the quality of the fish. There has to be bait in order to catch a fish. Lot, in the Old Testament book of Genesis, he was baited into moving into the notoriously wicked city of Sodom by nice, fertile land. David was baited into adultery with Bathsheba because he saw her taking a bath on her roof. We need to be clear. The devil is a master fisherman. He knows all kinds of shiny, nice things to dangle out in front of us. Things that will appeal to our innermost desires. And he'll insist that it's going to be wonderful. That God is unreasonable and that He's been holding out on us the entire time. But do not be fooled. The devil doesn't give good gifts because you will pay for everything you take from him. I'm going to say it again. The devil doesn't give good gifts because you will end up paying for everything you take from him. James continues in verse 16. He says, "Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created." James reminds the early church, and he reminds us here today, that God is a good Father who longs to give good gifts to His children. He's not to blame for our temptations. In fact, He chose to help us and rescue us out of our temptations through the word of truth. Why has God gone to these lengths? Why are we an investment worth making? Well, the answer is there in the text. So that we might be fruitful. Or put another way, so that we might be able to live the gospel on the ground. Temptation surfaces when our desires are appealed to in a wicked, pungent way. If temptation goes unchecked, desire gets pregnant with her child's sin. And once sin is born, she grows up, and she grows up fast. And before long, she swells up too, ready to burst with her baby, death. This is why temptation cannot go unchecked. Unchecked temptation ends in death. Unchecked temptation ends in death. Lot's unchecked temptation in the book of Genesis ended in the death of his wife. David's unchecked temptation ended in the death of Uriah, Bathsheba's actual husband, as well as the death of the baby conceived in he and Bathsheba's adulterous affair. Unchecked temptation ends in death. But here's where I want to land today. I want to drill down just a little bit deeper than here. Because most of us are not tempted to go sleep with another man's wife or another woman's husband. Most of us are not tempted to go rob millions of dollars, embezzle millions of dollars from the places we work, or to go knock off a bank. Most of us are not tempted to beat on or abuse our kids. But we are tempted to look at porn because we don't think that anyone will know. We are tempted to rob from God because, after all, He's got more than He'll ever need. We are tempted to make our children the most important things in the world because, after all, we believe that that's what good parents should do, right? If we're going to effectively live the gospel on the ground, we can't just avoid the big hooks and open widely for the tiny ones. Not killing, not sleeping around, not stealing doesn't make you a disciple of Jesus. The tiny hooks of lust, of selfishness, of idolatry are temptations that are just as deadly as murder, adultery, and theft. And if we compromise with them, it will kill our drive to genuinely follow Jesus. And it will keep us from living the gospel on the ground. Because unchecked temptation ends in death. James summarizes this idea in chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. And when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." So here's the deal. I've got just a few questions that I want to ask you this morning. Three questions I just want you to consider. What temptations are going unnoticed, unaddressed, unchecked in your life? And are you willing to do anything about it? Are you dodging big hooks only to fall prey to the tiny ones? Could the gospel go places and reach people that it hasn't if you started checking your temptations today? There's a really interesting animal that lives in Costa Rica. It's native there. It's a tiny little frog. It's known as the tomato frog. I think I have a picture of it for you. They call it the tomato frog because it looks like a tomato. Okay. And here's the thing about the tomato frog. It's really interesting for one very specific reason. When the tomato frog is bitten by a predator, it sweats out this poison all over its skin. And the attacking animal bites into the tomato frog, and it tastes the poison, and then it spits the frog out. But the problem is that by the time the predator spits out the tomato frog, the damage has already been done. The traumatized amphibian dies anyway. See, the poison is effective, but it's useless. Because it only takes effect. It's only activated once the frog has been attacked. And the reason I share this little tidbit about the tomato frog is this. If we're going to be disciples, if we're going to follow Jesus closely, if He's going to have our whole hearts, we can't wait until we're attacked or bitten by the enemy to protect ourselves. We can't wait until we're in the clutches of temptation to cry out for God's help. So I don't know if you do Facebook. If you don't, I'm not going to tell you that you're missing a whole lot. But if you are on Facebook, you may have seen that I said I was going to give out free money this week. Maybe that's why you're here today. I don't know. But true to my word, I'm going to give out some free money today. Ryan, he's going to play a song here in just a second. And if you have a decision that you need to make this morning, maybe you need to give your life to Jesus for the very first time. Or maybe you just need somebody to spend a moment praying with you. It's the perfect time to do one of those two things. If you're thinking about maybe joining Lincoln Hills, you'd like to become a member of this kind of crazy family, I can explain to you what your next step with that is too. But while we're worshiping, what I want you to do is up here on each side of the stage, I've got these two containers. And they're filled with pennies. And what I want you to do is I want you to come up and I want you to take a penny. I want you to go back to your seat. And I want you, as we worship, I want you to be in a spirit of prayer. I want you to ask God, what is it? What temptation is maybe running wild in my life? What is it that's going unchecked? That's keeping me from being the disciple that you want me to be? It's keeping me from truly living out the gospel on the ground. When God reveals that to you, whatever that might be, whatever temptation that's keeping you from following Him with your whole heart, when He reveals that to you, what I want you to do, I want you to take that penny and I want you to stick it in your shoe. And I know what you're thinking. Well, won't that be a little bit uncomfortable? Yeah, you ever had a penny in your shoe? Of course it's uncomfortable. But here's the thing. Your temptations are going unchecked for a reason. And if we're going to live out the gospel on the ground, then every step that we take needs to be one that is alert. Alert to the dangers that lurk around every corner. Every danger that seems to want to try to derail us. Yeah, it'll be uncomfortable, but it'll be worth it. If we're going to live out the gospel on the ground, we'll need to check all of our temptations, because unchecked temptations end in death. Being a disciple of Jesus requires us to be alert, avoiding big hooks as well as small ones. And if you want to take this penny thing just a little bit further, what you could do is once you have it in your shoe, maybe you go home and you look up a passage of Scripture. You know, if God has revealed to you that you're just a little bit too selfish, or you're just a little bit too arrogant or self-centered, or maybe you are prone to speaking before you think, whatever your thing is, perhaps you look up a passage of Scripture that you can associate with the penny that's in your shoe. And so every step that you take, when you feel it in there, you're reminded of that verse, and maybe you recite it to yourself. Again, we're going to live out the gospel on the ground, we need to be alert. We need to be prepared, not just for the big hooks, but for the small ones too. So if you have a decision to make, we're going to stand and sing. It'll be the perfect time to make one. And if you don't, that's okay. I want you to come up. I want you to grab a penny and take with you as we sing.